Oh, sorry, I'm not backing my microphone. Clever. A couple of comments on particular points that Dan has made. First of all, I deny that Eusebius is the first dishonest historian. There are quite a few ahead of him in that queue. Whether he's dishonest or simply has his own axe to grind and does so within the limits of the time is another question. But as for the claim that Josephus was evidence that Christians were willing to tamper with documents, it is worth saying that the Christian who tampered with the Slavonic edition of Josephus did so in the 8th or 9th century AD. What a particular Christian monk did in the 8th or 9th century AD is probably not general evidence that can be applied to any other Christian scribe from any other period. As for the comment that nobody quoted that bit of Josephus until Eusebius, do you know how much Josephus wrote? I know Dan was, because in his book he tells us he was given a copy of it for, I forget which birthday, 18th or 21st. Yeah. Josephus wrote about that thick. That particular passage was not quoted doesn't surprise me very much. It may be odd, but I don't know that you can make an argument out of it that this passage in Josephus is in some way suspicious. It is suspicious in that it says Jesus was the Christ, but what most scholars think is that it said something like, this man claimed to be the Christ. And a Christian scribe in the 8th or 9th century said, oh, no, that can't be right, he was the Christ, and corrected it. But the likelihood is that Josephus said something about Jesus claiming to be the Christ, and then commented, and his followers continue to follow him to this very day, i.e. about 95 AD. No problem there. The claim that Dan made that there is a steady curve between relatively unmiraculous accounts of the resurrection, I'm sorry, could we have that again? Relatively unmiraculous accounts of the resurrection. I'm just going to have to think about that for a moment or two. In the 50s with Paul, and then steadily getting more and more miraculous, is true up to a point. But the point is this: I don't agree for a moment that Paul thought the resurrection wasn't physical. His language is ambiguous on this point, it's true, but most scholars would be perfectly happy with the claim that Paul's language means he believes in the resurrection as physical and as trans-physical. I do not believe that under Paul the resurrection was only really an ascension to heaven. Not only that, I think it comes from earlier than Dan is willing to admit. When Dan describes it as a poetic or formulaic passage in Paul, more likely to be legend, I think this is seriously misleading. What it is a brief formulaic list of who saw Jesus after his resurrection, which Paul says he had already passed on to the Corinthians previously. That is around 51-52, when he originally converted them to Christianity. And he describes it then as that which was passed on to me as of first importance. In other words, this earliest document about, well, not document, this earliest report about the resurrection comes from not when Paul wrote in 55-ish, not even when Paul spoke to the Corinthians in 51, but from some earlier stage. And I ask you to note, we are now dealing with a period within less than 20 years of the claimed events. I would argue, and I'm not on my own, that it actually goes back to Paul's first visit to Jerusalem. When better to get an account of who saw Jesus after his resurrection, or at least, let it be said, who claimed to see Jesus after his resurrection, than when you go to Jerusalem and meet Peter. And when did that happen? Before 40. Before 40 AD. In other words, within less than 10 years of the claimed events. Dan dated the death of Jesus to 27 or so. The great majority of historians date it to either 30 or 33. One of those two, but there's only a 50-50 split as to which. In other words, I don't believe in this developing curve of the miraculous, or rather, I think it starts on a much higher threshold than Dan seems willing to admit. As for Tacitus not saying anything about Jesus, but only about the Christ, hello? Name me one other person in the first century who was called the Christ. Dan claimed, I put the wrong piece of paper, that there were several. I know of one he didn't mention, Menahem the Sicarius, but is there one other writer who calls Christians followers of anyone but Jesus? Answer, not a one. Robert Price is, as far as I'm concerned, the only professional historian I know of who thinks Jesus doesn't exist. I don't know Richard Carrier's status, so I won't comment on that. Earl Doherty, I don't think is a professional historian at all. I think he's in the category of the militant atheist amateurs. Intelligent, but not in any sense the scholarly mainstream.